focuses more on the concept of whale countries, big countries, particularly countries that have a very large domestic market. So the rise of the BRIC economies antecedes 2008 crisis by many years, but nevertheless, it has been the outset of the crisis that has anticipated the rise of these economies. Because in general, they were much less impacted by the crisis than the developed economies. And, you know, this is not surprising given that the epicenter of the crisis was in the United States. However, nonetheless, this is perhaps the first crisis that has hit harder the developed countries as opposed to the developing economies, or at least some of the developed economies. In this sense, it is unprecedented. If you think of other recent crises, such as the Asian crisis of the late 90s, or the Argentine crisis of the turn of the century, or the Mexican crisis of the mid-90s, they all had the epicenter in developing economies, and they spread first and foremost to other developing economies, which were hardest hit. And as a result of this, right in the aftermath of the crisis, Goldman Sachs reduced its previous estimates as to the time when the BRIC economies would reach the G7. Before, Goldman Sachs predicted that this would happen only in 2039. Since the crisis, they have reduced by 7 years. It has been predicted that the BRIC economies will reach the G7 by 2032. And particularly, China may surpass the U.S. in 16 years as well. This means that by 2027, Chinese economy might be the same size as the U.S. economy. And so the table shows, which I hope that you're seeing, shows precisely what I've been saying here. Since the 90s, the BRIC in general have been presenting very high rates of economic growth. Brazil was sluggish in the beginning, particularly during the entire 90s and the first years of the 21st century, and that's a reason for some people wanting to exclude Brazil from the acronym BRIC. However, it did pick up later in the first decade of the century, and it had a slightly negative growth rate during the crisis in 2009, but it recovered very quickly with a 7.5% growth rate in 2010. The other BRIC countries did better. Russia had very high rates of economic growth during the 21st century, and even more so China and India. And actually China has been growing on around 10% for the last 30 years, so that's not very surprising. But what is surprising is that it grew almost 9% in 2009 during the peak of the financial crisis. This is in contrast to the performance of the advanced economies, which you can see here. It has been a lot lower than this, around 2-3%, even lower for some economies. And during the crisis, the European Union has seen a sharp decrease of 4% negative growth, and the U.S. minus 2.5. And it also is superior to the performance of the world as a whole, as you can see in the last line of the table. So let me move on. If we look at the contribution to global economic growth, and this also has been mentioned this morning, the disparities are even more impressive. During the 90s, the BRIC contributed only 16% to global economic growth, whereas the developed economies contributed about 70%. During the first 6 years of the century, the 21st century, the BRICS increased to 24% of contribution to global growth, whereas the G7, 40%. Whereas in the aftermath of the crisis from 2007 all the way to 2009, the BRIC contribution to global growth has been 45%, far overcoming that of the G7, which has been only 20%, less than half percentage points. Therefore, we can see that the BRIC really have been the engine of economic growth for the world in the aftermath of the crisis, and particularly China. But the others have done well, though not nearly as well. Dá para mudar o slide, por favor? Global integration of BRIC economies. Okay, why did the BRIC outperform the developed economies? Well, here there seems to be a paradox, because the BRIC did have a very good performance during the crisis, but this happened precisely during the time when it was most integrated into the global economy. And this is a paradox, because if you have a greater insertion to world trade and investment flows, there are a larger number of channels through which the crisis of the world markets can contaminate your national economy. However, the BRIC countries at the same time prove to have fewer external vulnerabilities than the developed economies. According to economist Paul Krugman, in a recent article, developed countries have less tolerance for complacency and are more cautious with regard to irresponsible behavior, fiscal behavior, so to speak, because precisely they have suffered a lot more than the advanced economies in previous economic crises. And for this reason, they managed to accumulate significant foreign exchange reserves as well as to pay down their debts to a large extent. In the aftermath of the crisis, investors in the developed economies have also seen no good opportunities for profit in their own countries shifted to the BRICS, which also, in general, helped the recovery processes in the BRIC countries, but in Brazil in particular, this also has created other problems related especially to currency exchange. But that, again, will be the topic of another panel here. And so this is what the table shows. The share in world trade of the BRICS has increased considerably from the 1990 to 2009 in 10 years, and this has happened in all the 4 countries. Trade openness as well has increased considerably. It is noteworthy that Brazil is the least open country of the 4. The current account deficit as a percentage of GDP, which is a measure of external vulnerability, we have seen significant surpluses in both Russia and China, and deficits in Brazil and India, but they're not very, very significant. And foreign exchange reserves as a percentage of GDP also has increased quite significantly in all the countries, with the exception of China, but they were already quite significant in China in 1990. External debt is, well, here are absolute measures, but it's also not very worrisome, as the debt service ratio, which has remained steady, more or less steady in Brazil. It has increased significantly in Russia, and not surprisingly, Russia was the country that suffered the most during the crisis, and it has decreased significantly in both India and China. So please, next slide, which presents a table of crisis indicators. Let me focus on the impact of the crisis in each BRIC economy very briefly, and then try to draw out some conclusions. Like I said, Russia was the one who suffered the worst impact of the crisis among the BRIC. This was due primarily to the fall in oil prices, which constitutes the primary source of revenue for the country. And we can see this in the sovereign credit default swaps spreads, which have jumped by several hundred basis points. And actually, these sovereign credit default swaps can be seen as the perception of the probability that a country will default. And in the case of Russia, it seems to have increased significantly. As Russian banks and firms sought to hedge their foreign currency exposures, they also exacerbated pressures on the national currency, the ruble, and deposit outflows and some bank failures of small banks, but nonetheless have also contributed to increase the stress on the banking system. What were the policy responses? Well, Russia came up with one of the largest fiscal stimulus packages in the G20. It raised government expenditure and pushed government non-oil deficit significantly, but it was something that had to be done, apparently. The deficit went from 8.25% of GDP in 2008 to almost double, to 15% of GDP in 2009. The central bank steadily reduced interest rates, and the economy contracted by almost 8% in 2009. But it did revert back to a path of stability in the first quarter of 2010, with real GDP registering a growth of almost 3%.